You've been told that vulnerability is actually strength, that you need to be able to share your trauma in order to heal, and that emotional openness is always good, and emotional control is always toxic masculinity or repression or avoidance. Brene Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability is the fourth most watched TED Talk of all time. Therapy culture has convinced an entire generation that talking about your feelings publicly, consistently, and with strangers on the internet is not just healthy, but necessary for mental well being. But what if that is backwards? And that consistently rehearsing your pain is exactly what's keeping you stuck in it? The ancient Stoics knew something modern therapy culture has completely forgotten, that some emotions get stronger the more you feed into them. And vulnerability culture might not be building the resilience it claims to be, but instead building dependence. Therapeutic terminology borrows epistemic authority when it is used outside of clinical contexts. The term vulnerability is doing exactly this. When a therapist tells you to be vulnerable in a clinical setting, they mean something very specific. Opening up to a trained professional in a controlled environment designed for processing difficult emotions. But that term has crept into everyday usage to mean any emotional disclosure in any context. From working through childhood trauma with a psychologist to posting a crying selfie on Instagram for likes. These are not the same thing. But by using the same term, we borrow the therapeutic legitimacy of the first to justify the second. And we stop asking whether constant public emotional disclosure is actually helping anyone heal. Modern vulnerability culture has elevated this practice to the status of unquestionable virtue. If you're not doing the work by sharing your trauma publicly, then you're really emotionally stunted because you can't keep your pain private. On social media, emotional disclosure has become currency. People introduce themselves by listing their diagnosis. The deeper your wound, the more authentic you seem. But there is a massive difference between processing emotion and rehearsing it. So let's go back a couple thousand years to Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher who spent much of his life as a slave before gaining his freedom and teaching philosophy in Rome. Epictetus had a fundamental insight about emotions. It is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about them. This is not to say that emotions don't exist or that pain isn't real. He's saying that how we interpret events shapes how we experience them. And critically, the more we rehearse those interpretations, the more we strengthen the emotional response to them. Every time you tell your trauma story, you are re-experiencing the emotions attached to those facts and activating these same neural pathways. You're essentially training your brain to associate those memories with intense emotional responses. Rumination is the process of repeatedly dwelling on distressing thoughts and feelings, and is one of the strongest predictors of prolonged depression and anxiety. When you constantly rehearse your negative emotions, you're not actually processing them, you're strengthening them. And now look at Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote meditations while on military campaigns. People treat meditations like it's a journal of vulnerability, Marcus sharing his feelings with posterity. But that is a complete misreading. Meditations is a manual of emotional discipline. When Marcus writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events," realize this and you will find strength. He's not expressing his feelings for others to witness, but he's training himself and redirecting his attention away from what he cannot control towards what he actually can, like his own judgments and his responses to outside stimuli. Marcus did not write meditations to be read by others per se. He simply wrote it to control his own mind, and he was building the internal resilience, not seeking external validation from others. And this is where the Stoics diverged completely from modern vulnerability culture. The Stoics were obsessed with the distinction between what is in your control and what is not. Epictetus again says that some things are within our power while others are not. Within our power of opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, not within our power are the body, property, reputation. When you need external validation to feel okay, you've handed control of your emotional state to forces that you can't control. Other people's responses, the algorithm, whether your post goes viral. And that is most certainly not strength, but fragility disguised as authenticity. The Stoics had a very specific technique for building emotional resilience, which is the premeditation of evils. Regularly, you would imagine losing what you value most. Maybe your health, a loved one, your status, or possessions. And this trains you to handle the bad things in life before they actually happen. When bad things do inevitably occur, you're not completely blindsided by how you might feel because you've actually practiced the emotional response. And this is the opposite of vulnerability culture. Vulnerability culture says when something bad happens, immediately share it, talk about it, and process it publicly. And most importantly, never forget it. The Stoics said, prepare yourself internally so that when bad things happen, you already have the emotional tools to handle them. And then when they do happen, you won't be completely destroyed by them and you won't need external validation from strangers on the internet. Negative visualization is controlled exposure to difficult emotions. You're not ruminating on actual trauma that happened. And most importantly, you're doing it privately. And then you move on with your day. One builds dependence on external validation, and the other builds internal strength. Modern exposure therapy, which is highly effective for treating anxiety and PTSD, works on very similar principles. Controlled, gradual exposure to the feared stimuli, not constant rehearsal of traumatic memories in social contexts. So what happens when vulnerability becomes a social performance instead of a therapeutic process? Well, social media algorithms reward the emotional intensity, and the vulnerability posts get engagement. And this creates an intense dopamine feedback loop. You share pain and get validation, and then you feel better temporarily. But there is also a risk. Because if you are vulnerable on the internet, and the people that your vulnerability reaches do not share the same feelings, and instead criticize and ridicule you for having those feelings, then it can make the entire situation much, much worse. Because you have not built any internal capacity to handle that pain. You've simply been outsourcing your emotional regulation to an audience. And if every time you feel pain, your response is to broadcast it and wait for others, you're training yourself into a dependence pattern and not learning to sit with discomfort. You are not building the capacity to self-soothe. And over time, that pain can become your entire identity. You're not just someone who experienced trauma, you are a traumatized person. The wound becomes the most interesting thing about you. And people know you as the person who shares their struggles. And there is a perverse incentive to stay wounded, because healing means losing that social currency. Now, Marcus Aurelius understood this danger. One of the recurring themes in meditations is refusing to let suffering define you. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. He's saying that your relationship to it, i.e., how much power you give to it over your sense of self, is actually completely up to you. The Stoics acknowledge that bad things happen and that pain is real, but they also refuse to let that pain define them, and they process it internally and then just move forward. Vulnerability culture does the exact opposite. It says that your trauma is your identity, so you need to make it the center of your personality. And if you don't, you're really repressing those feelings. But what vulnerability culture won't tell you is that this entire framework is an ethical claim disguised as a psychological one. When therapy speak migrates from clinical contexts to everyday speech, it smuggles in value judgments while pretending to be neutral. The claim that you should be vulnerable is an ethical position about what makes a good life, but it is not a position that is built on psychology or science. But maybe the good life does not require constant emotional disclosure, but instead, privacy about your inner life is not repression. It's actually a lot closer to dignity. Self-sufficiency is not toxic. It's simply learning how to be mature. Now, difficulty is necessary for growth, but growth requires working through hardship, not endlessly discussing it with your peers. And notice that this does not mean you cannot feel or talk about your pain ever. It's simply about building the capacity to handle pain without needing constant external support. And it means that you can sit with discomfort without immediately broadcasting it to an audience. Because you don't need an audience to regulate your emotions. Because your identity is not your trauma. Because Epictetus was right. You have power over your own mind. And outsourcing that power to people that you may or may not know is one of the most destructive ways of going about vulnerability that we have ever seen. And look, nobody promised that life was going to be all that easy, but there are ways that you can be strong enough to handle it. And that does not require a single online post. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.